The house was quiet, except for the soft flickering of the oil lamps and the muffled voices coming from the main room. Rhoda moved carefully through the hallways, balancing a clay jug of water in her hands. A good servant was supposed to be invisible, silent and quick, never in the way. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, fear filled the house. She could feel it in the way the people spoke in hushed voices, in the way they clutched each other's hands when they prayed. The house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, had always been a place of faith and hope. The followers of Jesus gathered here regularly, sharing meals, telling stories of the miracles he had performed. This was a safe place. But tonight, no one was talking about miracles. Tonight, they were praying for Peter. Rhoda knew why. Everyone did. Peter had been arrested. Herod's soldiers had taken him away in chains. He was locked in prison under heavy guard, surrounded by soldiers. There was no way out. Rhoda shuddered as she set the water jug down. Her hands trembled slightly as she listened to the voices in the next room. "Rescue him, O God. Set your servant free." Rhoda wanted to believe their prayers would work. She wanted to believe that God would save Peter, but how could anyone escape Herod's soldiers? She sighed and turned toward the kitchen, but at that moment, knock, knock, knock. She froze. The voices in the other room went silent. No one knocked at this hour. The house was a secret meeting place for Jesus' followers. Anyone coming this late in the night had to know that, which meant either they were one of them, or they were coming to arrest them. Another knock, louder this time. Rhoda's heart pounded. No one moved. She could feel the weight of fear in the air. No one spoke. Then a voice, hoarse and desperate, came from outside the gate. "Rhoda, it's me. Open the door." Rhoda gasped. She knew that voice. She knew it as well as her own. It was Peter. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. It couldn't be, could it? She turned, looking back at the others. No one had moved. They were still whispering, still praying for Peter's release. But Peter was at the gate. She had to see for herself. Ignoring the pounding in her chest, she rushed toward the outer courtyard, slipping through the shadows. The knocking came again, quick and urgent. She reached the wooden gate and pressed her ear against it. Her body stiffened. It was him, Peter, alive, here. Without thinking, she turned and ran back toward the others. "Peter's at the gate!" she blurted out, her voice higher than she intended. "He's alive! He's standing outside right now!" Silence, and then laughter. Someone shook their head. "Rhoda, you're imagining things." "No!" she insisted, her eyes wide. "I heard him! He's there!" The others exchanged glances. Some chuckled softly, others looked at her with pity. "It must be his angel," a woman finally said. "Maybe God is showing you a vision." Rhoda clenched her fists. Why wouldn't they believe her? The knocking started again, this time more frantic. She turned back toward the door. She would open the gate herself. And when they saw what she had seen, everything would change. Rhoda's feet barely touched the floor as she raced back toward the gate, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the knocking anymore. "Peter, I'm coming," she called, fumbling with the latch. What if she was wrong? What if she opened the door and found someone else standing there? Or worse, what if it was a trick? But then, "Rhoda, hurry!" She knew that voice. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't an angel. With a deep breath, she threw open the gate, and there he was. Peter, alive, breathing. Standing in the moonlight, his face covered in sweat, his clothes wrinkled and dusty as if he had been running for miles. His chest rose and fell with every breath. His hands that had been chained in a prison cell, were free. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Peter laughed softly, shaking his head. "Rhoda," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you finally opened the door." She let out a strangled cry, half a laugh, half a sob. You're here. You're really here." She reached out as if to touch him, just to be sure he wasn't some kind of vision. But Peter grabbed her hands, gripping them tightly. His eyes were wild with urgency. "There's no time," he whispered. "I can't stay in the open. Let me inside." Rhoda's heart dropped. Of course. She whirled around and yanked him into the courtyard, shutting the gate behind them. "You escaped," she breathed. "How did you—" Peter put a finger to his lips. "I'll explain inside." They moved quickly through the dark hallways, Peter staying close to the walls, his eyes darting toward every shadow. Rhoda didn't realize she was holding her breath until they reached the main gathering room. The others were still praying. "Lord, protect Peter. Deliver him from prison. Let him escape safely." She threw open the door. "Peter is here!" she cried. "He's inside the house." The prayers stopped. Everyone turned. Silence. Peter stepped forward, his face illuminated by the glow of the oil lamps. "Peter, it can't be. Are we dreaming?" Peter held up his hands. "It's me, brothers. I'm alive." Chaos erupted. Voices overlapped. Some wept. Others laughed. A few even looked afraid, as if he truly were a ghost. "How?" someone finally managed to ask. "How are you here?" Peter exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "Sit down," he said. "I have a story to tell." Rhoda squeezed into a spot on the floor as Peter began to speak. "I was in prison," he said, "chained between two guards. There were soldiers outside my cell, more at the gates. Escape was impossible." Everyone leaned in. Peter's eyes darkened slightly. "I won't lie. I thought that was the end. I thought I would never see you again." He swallowed. "But then, something happened." Peter's voice lowered to a whisper. "I was asleep when a light filled the room. It wasn't from the torches outside. It was brighter, warmer, not of this world. Then I felt a hand on me." Peter touched his shoulder as if reliving the moment. "I opened my eyes and there he was, an angel of the Lord." Murmurs spread across the room. Rhoda felt her whole body tingle. "The angel spoke," Peter continued. "Get up quickly." Peter looked down at his hands. "And then, the chains fell off my wrists." Gasps. Rhoda's mouth dropped open. "Chains don't just fall off." "I thought I was dreaming," Peter admitted. "But I followed him. We walked past the guards. They didn't move. It was like they couldn't see us." Someone covered their mouth in shock. Peter shook his head in amazement. "We reached the iron gate leading to the city, and it opened by itself. We stepped into the streets, and suddenly the angel was gone. Just like that." Silence. No one breathed. Rhoda stared at Peter, her heart racing. She had believed God could rescue him. But this was beyond belief. "I stood there in the street realizing what had happened," Peter continued, his voice thick with emotion, "and I knew I had to get here, to you." He glanced around the room. "Because I know you were praying for me." Rhoda's eyes filled with tears. They had prayed for a miracle, and here he was, alive. A knock sounded at the door. Everyone jumped. Rhoda's heart nearly stopped. Peter's face hardened. He pulled his cloak tighter around him. "It's not safe for me to stay. If Herod finds out I'm gone, they'll search for me." One of the men nodded. "We'll get you somewhere safe." People rushed to gather supplies. Peter turned to Rhoda and smiled gently. "Thank you for believing first." She blinked, surprised. "But I almost didn't open the door." Peter chuckled. "Yes, but you were the first to hear, and that matters." Rhoda smiled back. As Peter slipped into the night, she watched him go, her heart full. She had seen a miracle with her own eyes. She had heard the answer before anyone else. And she would never doubt again. Rhoda lay awake long after Peter had disappeared into the night, her mind still racing with everything that had happened. She had heard the knocking first. She had recognized his voice first. She had seen the miracle before anyone else believed it. And now, Peter was gone, slipping through the streets of Jerusalem, hiding from Herod's soldiers. Rhoda hugged her knees to her chest, staring into the dim glow of the oil lamp beside her. She had never been afraid of the dark before, but tonight was different. Peter's escape was a miracle, but miracles didn't always mean safety. If Herod's men found out that this house had anything to do with it, they would come knocking again. But this time, not with Peter on the other side. A sudden noise outside made her jolt. A footstep? A whisper? She held her breath, listening. Nothing. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe she wasn't. The next morning, the entire house was buzzing with whispers. "Did you hear? Peter is gone. Herod is furious. I heard the guards were executed because of it." Rhoda's stomach twisted at that last sentence. The guards. They hadn't done anything wrong, at least not this time. But in Herod's eyes, their failure had sealed their fate. As she carried a tray of water pitchers through the house, she caught pieces of frantic conversation from the other believers. "They'll be searching for him everywhere. He has to get out of Jerusalem. Herod won't stop until he finds someone to blame." Rhoda knew exactly what that meant. They were all in danger now. As she passed by the main room, she saw Mary, John Mark's mother, speaking in hushed tones to a group of men. "We need to be careful," Mary said. "Peter is safe for now, but they may come for us next." One of the men nodded. "We'll move to another meeting place. Lay low until things settle." Rhoda's chest tightened. Move? Leave? Was this what it meant to follow Jesus? To always be running? She had always known it was dangerous to be part of the believers. Ever since Jesus had been crucified, his followers had been treated like criminals. But this was the first time she had truly felt it, the fear, the uncertainty, the weight of what they were risking, and yet, hadn't she seen proof that God was watching over them? Hadn't she seen a man walk free from Herod's chains? She took a deep breath, setting her tray down. Maybe she was just a servant girl, but she knew one thing: God had not rescued Peter just to abandon the rest of them now. Later that afternoon, Rhoda was sweeping the courtyard when a shadow fell over her. She looked up and froze. A Roman soldier stood at the gate. Her hands tightened around the broom handle. "Stay calm, stay calm." The soldier's face was unreadable. "Is this the house of Mary?" Rhoda hesitated. If she said yes, would he come inside? Would he start asking questions? She forced a polite smile. "Who is asking?" His jaw tightened. "We're searching for Simon Peter. Have you seen him?" Her heart slammed against her ribs. What should she say? Tell the truth? Lie? Stay silent? The soldier narrowed his eyes. "You're one of them, aren't you?" But then a voice called from inside. "Rhoda, bring more water." The soldier turned his head slightly toward the doorway, distracted for just a moment. Rhoda grabbed the chance. She spun on her heel and darted through the courtyard, slipping through the back entrance before he could stop her. Her lungs burned as she ran, her feet barely touching the stone floor. She didn't stop until she was inside, behind the others, breathless and shaking. "Rhoda?" Mary's voice was concerned. "What happened?" Rhoda swallowed hard. "A soldier. They're looking for Peter." Silence fell over the room. Everyone looked at one another. Then Mary's voice was firm. "Then we need to be ready." That night, Rhoda sat near the window, watching the streets, listening for footsteps, for voices, for anything out of place. She knew things would never be the same, and yet she wasn't afraid anymore. She had heard Peter's voice when no one else believed. And if God had been watching over Peter in chains, he was certainly watching over them now. Her story wasn't over, and she would not be afraid. The city of Jerusalem was buzzing with fear. Word had spread quickly. Peter was gone. No one knew where he had fled, but everyone knew Herod was furious. Soldiers marched through the streets, knocking on doors, questioning shopkeepers and stopping travelers at the city gates. No one was safe. If they couldn't find Peter, they would find someone to punish instead. Rhoda could feel the tension everywhere she went. People whispered in the marketplace. Families locked their doors at night. The believers, her people, were moving in secret, gathering in different places every night, never staying in one house too long. The safe world she had known was gone. She had always believed in Jesus. She had heard the stories of his miracles, had listened as the apostles spoke about his resurrection, but now it was real. Faith was no longer just words, it was a risk. And yet, deep in her heart, she knew she would not turn back. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Rhoda slipped through the narrow streets with Mary, John Mark, and a few others. They were heading to a new meeting place, a small house near the outer wall of the city. Rhoda kept her hood up, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. Was anyone watching them? The streets felt different now. People moved with guarded expressions, their voices hushed. Even those who didn't follow Jesus seemed to know something dangerous was happening. When they reached the house, a man opened the door just wide enough for them to slip inside. Rhoda stepped into the dimly lit room, her eyes adjusting to the flickering glow of oil lamps. The room was packed. Men, women, and children huddled together, some sitting on the floor, others pressed against the walls. They looked up as Mary and the others entered, faces tight with worry. A man near the front spoke. "Herod has ordered more arrests. Anyone caught speaking about Jesus could be taken." A murmur spread through the room. Someone clenched their fists. Others exchanged anxious glances. Rhoda's chest tightened. More arrests? Who would be taken next? A woman near the back spoke softly. "What do we do? Do we run?" Rhoda looked to Mary, expecting her to say yes, but instead, Mary stood tall and shook her head. "We do what we have always done," she said firmly. "We pray." Silence fell over the room. Then slowly, one by one, people nodded. They knelt. They lifted their voices. And just like the night they had prayed for Peter, they prayed boldly. She prayed not just for safety, but for courage. The night dragged on, but Rhoda couldn't sleep. She sat near the window watching the street outside. The shadows shifted under the moonlight, and every distant footstep made her pulse quicken. Then, a noise. Rhoda stiffened. Someone was in the alley. She held her breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside the house. Her fingers curled around the edge of the wooden windowsill. Was it soldiers? Had someone betrayed them? She heard voices, low, urgent whispers. Then a gentle knock. Rhoda's pulse pounded in her ears. She turned to Mary. "Someone's at the door." The room went still. A man by the doorway motioned for silence. He crept forward, pressing his ear against the wooden gate. More whispers. Then, a name. A name Rhoda knew. Her breath caught. Gasps filled the room. Someone stood up too quickly, knocking over a clay cup. It shattered against the floor. The same Saul who had arrested the followers of Jesus. The same Saul who had approved of Stephen's execution. The same Saul who had once hunted them. "What was he doing here?" a voice whispered. "It's a trap." Another. "We can't trust him." Rhoda looked at Mary. "What do we do?" Mary's face was unreadable. Then, slowly, she stepped toward the door. Rhoda held her breath as Mary opened it. And there, standing in the moonlight, was a man who had once been their greatest enemy. But his eyes were not the same. They were soft, humble. And when he spoke, his voice was not filled with anger. "I was blind," he swallowed, "but now I see." Rhoda's breath caught in her throat. She had seen a miracle at the gate before, and she was about to see another. The room was frozen in silence. Rhoda's pulse pounded as she stared at Saul of Tarsus, the man who had once been their greatest threat. She knew the stories. Everyone did. Saul had been a hunter of Christians, dragging men and women from their homes, throwing them into prison. He had approved of Stephen's execution, watching as the stones crushed the life out of him. And now, here he stood, in the dim light of their hidden meeting place, his hands open, his voice soft. "I know you don't trust me," he said. "I don't blame you." No one moved. Rhoda could feel the tension, the fear. The men standing near the doorway still looked ready to fight or flee. Then Mary, John Mark's mother, stepped forward. "You say you were blind?" she said cautiously. "What do you mean?" Saul swallowed hard. "I was on the road to Damascus. I was going to arrest more of you, more followers of Jesus." He exhaled, shaking his head. "But then a light surrounded me. Brighter than the sun, I fell to the ground. I heard a voice." Rhoda leaned forward. "A voice?" "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" he whispered. The words hung in the air. Rhoda shivered. Jesus spoke to him. "I asked, 'Who are you, Lord?'" Saul continued. "And he answered, 'I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting.'" Gasps spread through the room. A man near the back crossed his arms. "And we're supposed to believe you've changed?" Saul met his eye. "I was blind for 3 days. I didn't eat or drink. But then a disciple named Ananias, one of the very people I came to arrest, was sent to me by the Lord. He laid hands on me, and my sight was restored." Rhoda saw the pain in his face. He wasn't telling this story to convince them. He was telling it because he had lived it. "I have been wrong," Saul said simply. "I see that now." He stepped forward, looking at each of them in turn. "I have come to tell you that I now serve the very Jesus I once hated." Silence. Rhoda held her breath. No one spoke. No one moved. Then a single sound broke through the stillness. Barnabas! He stood up from the corner of the room, stepping into the firelight. "I believe him." Rhoda's heart jumped. Barnabas, the encourager, the man everyone trusted, was standing with Saul. The others looked at him in shock. "Barnabas, how can you—" "I've heard his story," Barnabas interrupted. "I've seen the way he speaks of Jesus. He is not the same man." Saul stood quietly, waiting, not pleading, not begging, just waiting. Barnabas turned to Mary. "We must let him in." Mary hesitated. Rhoda could see the war in her eyes, but then, slowly, she nodded. A breath of relief passed through the room. Saul had been an enemy. That night, Saul stayed with them. Rhoda sat in the corner, watching as the others whispered in quiet groups, still unsure of what to do with him. Some were open, asking questions. Others kept their distance. Could a man like Saul really change? She didn't realize she was staring at him until he looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, she froze. Then Saul smiled softly. She hesitated, then smiled back. Something in his eyes was different. For the first time, she believed it. He really had changed. Days passed. Saul became part of their meetings, speaking of Jesus, preaching boldly in the streets, but Herod's men were still searching for Peter. The danger wasn't over. One afternoon, as Rhoda carried water to the upper room, she heard urgent voices from inside. She crept closer. Mary was speaking. "It's not safe for Saul here. The Jews want him dead." Barnabas nodded. "Then we send him away. Let him return to Tarsus, for now." Rhoda's heart sank. Saul had just become one of them. And now? He had to leave? She didn't realize she had stepped into the room until Saul turned toward her. "Rhoda." His voice was gentle. "I won't be gone forever." She bit her lip. "But where will you go?" "Wherever the Lord sends me." She looked down. She wasn't sure what she had expected him to say, but somehow it still made her chest tighten. Mary placed a hand on Rhoda's shoulder. "The Lord brought him here once. He will bring him back again." Rhoda nodded slowly. Maybe that was true. Maybe this wasn't the end of the story. The next morning they watched as Saul left Jerusalem. Barnabas walked beside him, talking, laughing. Rhoda saw how Saul no longer walked alone. She had feared him once. Now, she knew better. She had seen a miracle at the gate, and she had just seen another. Jerusalem felt different after Saul left. The house of Mary was quieter. The believers still met, still prayed, still spoke about Jesus. But the fear was still there. Herod's soldiers were watching more closely than ever, searching for anyone connected to Peter's escape. Rhoda could feel the weight of it every time she stepped outside. She walked through the marketplace with her hood pulled low, carrying a basket of bread for the others. Conversations around her sounded normal, but underneath it, she sensed something had shifted. And then she heard it. A merchant muttered under his breath, "Another one of them was arrested." Rhoda's breath caught. "Who?" A woman nearby whispered, "I heard they dragged him through the streets. Herod is trying to silence them all." Rhoda's grip on the basket tightened. This wasn't over. Back at the house, Mary and the others gathered around, talking in hushed voices. Rhoda set the basket down, listening. "What happened?" she asked. Mary met her eyes. "It's getting worse," she said. "Herod is going after more of us." A man sitting near the window nodded. "We've been careful, but it's not enough. They're looking for anyone who follows Jesus." Rhoda's stomach twisted. Anyone. That meant her too. She had always known following Jesus was dangerous, but before it had felt distant, like something that only happened to the apostles, to the leaders. But now it was real. She looked around the room at the others. Some were afraid. Some were determined. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Barnabas, who had returned after escorting Saul, looked up. His voice was calm, steady. "We knew this day would come. We were never promised safety, only that Jesus would be with us." Rhoda swallowed hard. Jesus had never promised easy, but he had promised to be near. That night, as Rhoda lay awake on her sleeping mat, she thought about Peter in prison, about how she had been the first to hear his voice at the gate. She had been the first to know he was free. And yet, even after witnessing that miracle, she still felt afraid now. Would she be strong enough if they came for her? Would she stand firm, or would she run? She squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to be afraid. She wanted to believe. "Lord," she whispered into the dark, "help me trust you, even when I'm scared." A gentle breeze moved through the open window, cooling her face, and in that quiet moment, she felt peace. The next morning, Rhoda went to fetch water from the well. She had only taken a few steps into the street when she heard a shout, then running footsteps. Her heart leapt as a man came sprinting past her, his face pale with fear. The man ran faster. They were chasing him. "Another one of these Jesus followers, huh?" one soldier sneered. Rhoda's chest tightened. "Another one?" She recognized the man now, one of the believers. She wanted to run to him, to help, to do something, but she couldn't move. The soldiers dragged him away, and Rhoda could do nothing but watch. Back at the house, she told the others what she had seen. A heavy silence filled the room. "It's only going to get worse," one man muttered. Barnabas looked around. His face was troubled, but his voice was strong. "Then we must be ready," he said. "The gospel is not just for Jerusalem. It must go further. We have to take the message beyond this city, beyond what Herod can control." A man near the door hesitated. "Leave, but this is our home." Barnabas met his gaze. "Jesus told us to go into all the world and make disciples. Maybe this is how he moves us forward." Rhoda's heart raced. Leave Jerusalem. She had never thought about it before. Her whole life had been here. The streets she knew, the people she cared for, it was all here. But now the cost of staying was growing too high. Maybe it was time to go. That night, as Rhoda sat by the window, she looked out over the rooftops of Jerusalem. She had always thought she would grow old here, but now, as she watched the moonlight spill across the city, she felt something new. A pull, a whisper, a calling. Jesus had led Peter out of chains. Jesus had changed Saul from an enemy to a brother. And maybe now, Jesus was leading them somewhere new. Rhoda didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The house was filled with quiet urgency. For years it had been a safe place, a home for believers, a place of prayer, of whispered songs, of stories about Jesus. But now it was a place of danger. Herod's men were watching the city closely. Every day, more followers were arrested. Every day, more homes were searched. And now the believers were making a choice. They wouldn't just hide. They wouldn't just wait for Herod's soldiers to find them. They were going. Rhoda stood by the door, watching as people hurriedly gathered their things: food, water, scrolls of scripture carefully wrapped in cloth. Mary placed a hand on Rhoda's shoulder. "Are you ready?" she asked. Rhoda hesitated, looking around. "I never thought I would leave Jerusalem." Mary smiled gently. "Neither did I. But following Jesus means going wherever he leads." Rhoda swallowed hard. She had never traveled far from the city. The streets of Jerusalem were all she had ever known. But now they weren't just her streets, they were traps. She looked at Mary, at Barnabas, at the others. They weren't just running. They were spreading the message of Jesus. And something deep inside her knew this was the way it had to be. She nodded. "I'm ready." The journey began at nightfall. They moved carefully through the streets, avoiding the main roads, slipping through alleys and narrow passageways. Rhoda kept her hood pulled low, her heart racing at every distant sound of boots on stone. Finally, they reached the city gates. They waited, watched. Then when the guards turned their backs for a moment, they slipped through. Rhoda didn't breathe again until she felt the cool night air on her face, the walls of Jerusalem shrinking behind them. They had done it. They were free. But the journey was only beginning. Days passed. The road was rough. Their feet ached. Their supplies ran low. But with each mile, something changed. The fear that had once filled Rhoda's chest began to fade. She listened as Barnabas and the others talked about the places they would go, the people who still hadn't heard about Jesus. Cities across Judea, towns along the coast, villages scattered in the hills, places where the name of Jesus had never been spoken aloud. For the first time, she realized, the story wasn't ending here. It was just beginning. One evening, as they camped near a river, Rhoda sat beside Mary, watching the stars flicker above them. "This feels strange," she admitted. "I thought leaving would be terrifying, but it's not." Mary smiled. "Because you know who is leading us." Rhoda nodded slowly. She thought about Peter, chained in prison, only to be set free. She thought about Saul, once an enemy, now a brother. She thought about the others, bold enough to leave behind everything they had known. She had been afraid before, but now she was walking into the unknown with faith. And for the first time, she understood what it meant to truly follow Jesus. A story that never ends. Years later, as Rhoda sat among a group of believers in a new city, she listened as someone told the story of Peter's escape. "The servants in the house thought it was a dream," a man laughed. "They didn't believe he was really there." Rhoda smiled. She knew the story better than anyone, because she had been the one to hear the knock. She had been the one to recognize his voice. She had been the one to run before anyone believed. And now, years later, she knew that wasn't the end of the story. The church was growing. New believers were coming every day, and Rhoda was still a part of it. Because the story of Jesus never truly ends. It only spreads further, and she had been there when it all began. There when it all began.